Good morning. We're carrying on today with this short sermon series on Philippians that we began last week. I would think it's pretty safe to say that Paul's letter to the Philippians is amongst most Christians these days their favourite letter from the extant Pauline corpus, for good reason. Whereas we meet an erudite Paul in Romans, and even, dare I say, a bombastic Paul in Galatians, and a sometimes caustic Paul in 2 Corinthians, and at times a baffling Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Here we find a very personal and warm human being who pours out a heart of affection for his close friends in Philippi. In short, many of us like Philippians because we like the Paul we meet here. Andy set out the context for us last Sunday. So as we work through this letter that the great apostle writes from his prison cell, we're going to use a moment in the second half of the first chapter as we consider today's title, Choosing to Make Today Count. So we're going to think about something remarkable that Paul says and what that means for us, how that might speak to us in these times. There's so much to say about this passage, but we're going to confine our thinking to this one moment, this one point in verse 21, this incredible verse that illuminates the letter. Paul writes, "To live is Christ, to die is gain." To live is Christ, to die is gain. How can Paul be so positive and not be overwhelmed by the desperate situation that he finds himself in? Paul is literally chained to a guard all hours of the day. What a nightmare. It's not just that he is in a demeaning and demoralizing and dehumanizing situation, but let's be honest, his career, which was to plant churches, seems to be completely scuppered now. Here he is, potentially facing execution, and yet he says it doesn't matter to me. It does not matter if I live or die. And that's not resignation. He's triumphed in there. He's not discouraged and he's not in despair. Why? Because he has a definition of life that changes everything and allows him to face anything. Paul is teaching here in this passage that it's not the circumstances of your life, whether things are going well for you or not. It's not the circumstances of your life, but rather the way you define your life that will determine whether you stand or fall. What is my definition of life? What is your definition of life? What are you living for? What is the most important thing to you? Therefore, what is it that will make your life worth living regardless of what else happens? If you're anything like me, we don't really stop to ask ourselves what is life until something terrible happens. But here is Paul in this terrible situation, his literal lockdown, writing to his friends with a definition of life rooted in his heart and mind that allows him to say that this incarceration doesn't matter. Don't worry about me, he says. I may live another 20 years. I may die tomorrow. It doesn't matter. This situation isn't harming my life. That which I live for isn't touched by this situation. Incredible, right? If we take a moment to see how Paul triumphed, I think we can see how we can triumph despite where we find ourselves, Paul tells his friends, "For to me, to live is Christ, to die is gain." It's a win-win situation, guys. Paul is either going to be living for Christ, working for him, planting churches or ministering to whichever Praetorian guard he's chained to at that moment in time. And I mean, basically, if your job in the palace is to sit with and be chained to the most effective evangelist that's ever walked the earth, you're probably going to hear and be persuaded by the gospel and his definition of life, right? That it's all about Christ. So for Paul, he's either living for Christ, or if they execute him, he dies. He'll be living with Christ. Win-win. As I look into Paul's heart here, as he makes that declaration, let me level with you. I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's a choice I've made for my life. And it's what I want to spend my time doing, teaching and telling people about Jesus, about Christ. But I don't find it easy. Too often, to live for Christ is not my bottom line. I mean, it's my heart's desire all the time. But in truth, my career, my family, even my possessions seem to be more of what I'm about. I certainly do not wish to imply that if you're a Christian, it's easy. We just get over it and get on with it, so to speak. Of course, that is not the case. We slip, we get distracted, we get disillusioned, we get lazy, spiritually speaking. But here is an incredible reminder that whatever the devil wants to do with this horrible season, whatever he thinks he can deconstruct, he can steal, he can kill and destroy, if my life is defined by Christ, then whatever happens, I do not fall. And it's not about leaving that there as an unattainable spiritual state that only the really seriously religious get. Only one in so many holy people actually realize that state. It's not about that at all. You see, it's Jesus that takes a first step in this relationship. Listen, in John chapter 17, verse 19, Jesus says, is in front of his disciples and he's praying to his Father, and he says, "For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified." It's sometimes translated, "For their sake I consecrate myself, that they too might also be truly consecrated." You know what that means? Jesus Christ is saying, I live for them. Being sanctified means I set myself apart just to see them sanctified and holy. A friend of mine was telling me this week about a documentary that I haven't seen. It's about Tiger Woods, the great golfer, perhaps the greatest ever golfer, and how his commitment to his golf was incredible, unthinkably unrelenting. All day, every day for 10 years, he literally practiced non-stop. My friend couldn't believe he was a high achiever himself. He could not believe how committed he was to become what he became. Everything became subservient in Tiger Woods' life to that goal, that result. And he became a golfer that played a game that no one else ever played. Everyone else, even the best of the rest, could only dream of playing like this kid, Tiger Woods. Well, Jesus Christ says, everything about me, my life, the reason I was incarnate, I left my Godhead to become a human being, the reason I died, everything I am doing in heaven now, everything is subservient to one goal, your perfection and happiness. Jesus says to his Father, I am set apart for them. We look at Jesus dying on the cross for us, and we see into his heart, and we see it's all for us. It's for you, it's for me. If it's like Jesus is saying, for me to live is you. Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity, eternal God, says, for me to live is you. I want to see you holy and happy. I want to see you sanctified. What does it mean when you see me up here on a cross? I'll tell you what it means. It means I'm willing to do anything to have you with me. As we think about that, our response must surely be, Jesus, my Saviour, my King, my friend, if for you to live is me, well then, for me to live is you. For me to live is Christ, because he started the love affair. I want to leave that passage for a moment with that truth in our hearts, because we're all aware these are scary, unprecedented times. Being asked to commit to social distancing, staying at home. We've had to behave in a way we've never had to behave before. And some of us will have seen livelihoods decimated. Some of us will have experienced relationships put under insurmountable pressure. Some of us will have experienced a loneliness in isolation that has been incredibly painful, even frightening. And it seems to me that our resolve is tested the longer this goes on. I feel like, we're like a child in a car journey, asking the parents, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Every parent has known that frustration, The question is, are we there yet? It's a fair question, because it's actually a question I think is part of the human condition. It's in our nature. And it's also, I think, part of the spiritual life of people. And it's something that's part of the experience of God's people. Way back in the book of Exodus, Moses is told by God to lead his people out of Egypt and to the land he had promised them, a land flowing with milk and honey. It shouldn't take long. If you're familiar with that part of the world, once they leave Egypt, it's a pretty short trek across the Sinai Peninsula. That's what they have to cross to get to the promised land, and it would take them by a direct route of 4 to 6 weeks. It was a well-known road in the ancient world, but they didn't take that road. That's what everyone would expect, but God leads them on a very different route for good reason, but nonetheless a very circuitous route, the roundabout way, we'll call it. Now you have to imagine how disorientated this is going to be to the people. God has delivered them from their oppressor, but now he's taken them in the wrong direction. The promised land is, they know, northeast, but they're being led south. The great question is, will people follow God when they don't understand God? Will they follow him when following does not get them where they think they want to go? Will they persist? Will they stay faithful on the roundabout way of God? I raise this issue because right now all of us know about the roundabout way, where we find ourselves where we do not want to be. It's part of the human condition, and one of God's most irritating qualities for a lot of us is that he just doesn't seem to be in a hurry like we are. This is not a minor detour for Moses and his crew. In fact, Israel would spend 40 years on this roundabout way. It should have been 4 to 6 weeks. For the desert, in our day and age, let's read lockdown. The desert is a place you don't want to be. You don't want to go. It's a place that's not flowing with milk and honey and great jobs and wonderful dates. It's a dry and barren place. Worse, you don't know how long you're going to be there. There will be people listening to this whose experience of lockdown has not been particularly tough. That's the truth of the matter. But there are folks listening this morning, joining with us, and maybe you're one of those. And maybe you're on your knees saying, I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. And moreover, you're not sure why God is allowing you to experience this. I want to tell you, whoever you are and wherever you are, when the desert comes, because it will, it does not mean that God has forgotten about you. It does not mean that there is no God or that you have been abandoned. God is often at work in the roundabout way of the desert in ways I don't see, don't understand. There was a good reason why God took Moses and his people on this route. Why it took 40 years and not weeks. I don't know who first said it, but there's much truth in the idea that it took one day to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but 40 years to get Egypt out of the Israelites. God was doing a work in that time. God's way is rarely the quickest, rarely the easiest, but the only alternative to God's way is the way of despair. Of course, this horrendous virus has brought unthinkable death and catastrophic economic ruin, the effects of which we have yet to experience and watch play out, frankly. God did not cause this virus, but he can and will use this time, this season that we find ourselves in, this desert place. Maybe the desert is the place where you can learn to love God just because he's God, because he's so good, and not because of the milk and honey he gives you. Here is Paul in his desert place. His lockdown was literally a prison cell, chained to a guard who was there to dehumanize him, and yet he hears the apostle declare, to live is Christ, to die is gain. So, when you're in the desert, and we all will be in the desert at some point, don't give up. Life's not about milk and honey. It's not about the land. It's not about the job. It's not about the house. It's not about the money. You are on a roundabout way with God right now. It is in the desert, oddly enough, that we find the only hope worth having, and that is the Christian hope. That is the hope of Jesus. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know why you're going through the desert you go through. What I do know is that the Bible tells us that God came to earth in the form of Jesus. When he did that, he didn't take the shortest route to the throne of power. He didn't take the easy route. He went by the roundabout way through the desert. He humbled himself to become obedient, taking on the form of a slave washing feet. His walk to his death was from the temple to the cross, through this winding road of great suffering and great hostility, carrying a cross on his back with a mob ridiculing him. A walk that became known to his followers as the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrows, the way of suffering. That's our God, the roundabout way. I don't understand this season, but if you will go with him on the roundabout way, the way of the desert, the way of the cross, the way of surrender, the way of faith, Jesus says you will surely know one day the triumph of the resurrection and the glory and hope and life that comes with Jesus Christ. Are we there yet? No, not yet. One day. Not yet. Could be a long time. Probably will. It's okay. Be patient. It's coming. That's why we can respond to God who gave up everything for us. It's why we can declare, for me to live is Christ. And you can't take that away from me. Amen.